Good morning. So, as Elad said, my name is Elad Yom-Tov. I work for Microsoft Research in Israel. And for my background is in machine learning, but for the past few years, I've been interested in what we can learn about health and medicine from the stuff people leave on the internet, user-generated content. Now, the reason for this will become apparent when you look at the statistics. This is from Pew surveys in 2010. And they found that 77% of the people in the US are connected to the internet. About half of the Americans use the internet for 2 hours a day. But what's really interesting is that 80% of internet users, when they have a medical concern, will try and search for it on the internet. Will try and find some information or interact with other people on the internet to satisfy their information need about that medical concern. So it seems that we have a lot of data to work with if we want to learn about medicine. On the other hand, if you were to go and do a large-scale medical trial in the physical world, that's very expensive and it's very time-consuming. And so what I would like to do is I would like to try and marry the data that we have from the internet with medical knowledge in order to learn something interesting. And I think this is really a useful case for a place where we need medical doctors to make sense of our findings. We need machine learning in order to make sense of the data, because there is so much of it that trying to look at the data manually or without any form of machine learning is pretty much impossible. And so we've looked at a bunch of cases ranging from finding new side effects of medical drugs that the FDA was not aware of, to more recently trying to predict when people will have a psychiatric event based on their queries. And today, I want to talk about two studies related to one disease, and that disease is anorexia. Anorexia strikes between 0.33% and 1% of people in Western countries, mostly women, mostly in their late teens, although that's changing. And Israel is relatively advanced in the handling of anorexia, especially with regards to laws, which we'll get to in a minute. What's really starting about anorexia when you start to look at it is that there's a large group of patients which view anorexia not as a disease, such as it's defined in DSM-4, but as a lifestyle choice. And so you'll see quotations such as these: thinness, perfection, I'll die to achieve it, I only feel beautiful when I'm hungry, and so forth. And they have their own websites to promote this kind of view, which is called Proanorexia or Proana. These websites both try and convey information about the disease, but also how to stay in it. And another thing that they do is they post these kinds of photographs, which are called thinspiration. These are photographs designed to inspire other patients to lose more weight or to stay in their low weight. These are usually either photographs of patients themselves or of models or celebrities which are perceived as anorectic, even if they're not. And so we were wondering, what can we learn when we look at this pro-anorexia community versus the pro-recovery community? Specifically, we looked at not a site which is used only by these people, but at a general photo sharing site known as Flickr. Flickr was originally designed for professional photographers, and then it became a more general website for sharing photographs. And it's really interesting because there are several social networks in it. So this is a typical photo page from Flickr. This one is, again, a thinspiration photograph. And what you see here beside the photograph are the following. So we have, at the bottom here, we have a place for people to leave comments. So I can leave comments to somebody else's photograph. If they don't like them, they can delete them. Otherwise, it stays. I can also favorite somebody else's photograph. So that's another kind of connection between me and him. One more thing that we have are the tags over here. Because we're not very good at searching inside of photographs, Flickr asks users to tag their photographs with some kind of words that describe this photo, and then when we try to search for these photos, we actually search these tags as well as the description here. So I'll say that two users are maybe similar or connected if they have very similar tags to each other. And finally, we have the contacts over here. So I can ask somebody to be my contact, and then we're connected one to the other. So overall, you see we have 4 networks implied in this site, which we can study and try to learn something about. So what did we do? We took a bunch of users. First, users who tagged their photographs with what we deemed as relevant tags, things like thinspiration, thinspo, which is just a short of that, Proana, and so forth. That comes up to 162 users. Users who are part of an eating disorder group on Flickr, a few more, and then everybody who commented or favored one of the photographs of the 2 above. And that gives us a pretty nice sized data set. So we have about 500,000 photographs, slightly over 2 million comments, and the like. And we asked 2 independent people to rate each of the 800 or so users as to how pro-anorexia or pro-recovery they were, or no bias at all. So we have this 5-point scale, and we have a pretty good inter-annotator agreement, because when you look at these people, it's relatively easy to say what's their stance. So if they're very pro-ana or very pro-recovery, it is pretty easy to see. Okay, so we had these 4 social networks, and I'll show you how we can lay them out when we try to see visually what happens here. So blue dots here are pro-recovery users, red dots are pro-anorexia. And what I'm showing here is the largest connected components. When we look at the social network implied by the comments, by the contacts, favorites, and tags. And the edges here are set so we have about the same density as in the other charts. And what you see is, first of all, it's really hard to separate anything according to the tags, and we'll get to that in a minute. If we use a classifier, a nearest neighbor classifier, it also bears out. So the area under the ROC for contacts and comments is about 0.74, so we have a pretty good separation between pro-anorexia and pro-recovery, just looking at the neighbors. For favorites, it's relatively poor, and tags I'll show you in a minute. So for tags, we will say that 2 users are connected if they use very similar tags. And the first thing which we see is when we look at their similarity, we find that this is the similarity between pro-anorexia users. This is the similarity between pro-recovery, and between pro-recovery and pro-anorexia, it's somewhere in the middle. So if you're a pro-recovery person, your tags are more similar to a pro-anorexia user than they are to people in your class, which is strange. And it also comes out in the ROC, again, using a nearest neighbor classifier. We barely can make any sense of distinguishing between the users. And when we look at the tags, we see a very similar picture. So the tag thinspiration, which we thought would obviously be used only by the pro-anorexia users, is actually used by a significant percentage of the pro-recovery ones. So 37% pro-anorexia, 7% of pro-recovery users. And the pro-anorexia tag, which is even more obvious before you look at the data, is actually used more by the pro-recovery users than the pro-anorexia. And the question is why? Why do we see this picture where we can distinguish between users according to contacts and comments, but not favorites and tags? So one thing, as I mentioned before, is that comments and contacts are moderated by the receiving user. If somebody gives me a comment and I don't like it, I can delete it. So the fact that I keep the comment actually implies something about me rather than just about the person who sent it. So that's why comments and contacts are such good ways to distinguish users. The more interesting question, perhaps, is about the tags. Why aren't tags a good way to distinguish users? And we think this is the reason. If you were to put in a query such as thinspiration into Flickr, these would be the thumbnail pictures that you would get as results. Now, at a first glance, these would seem to be pretty much pro-anorexia pictures. However, at a second glance, all those photographs which are marked here in yellow are actually pro-recovery photos. So these are photos that people who want to tell other people with anorexia that they are making a mistake and they should seek medical help. But the only way that they can get their content in front of the pro-anorexia people who search for pro-anorexia terms is, in fact, to masquerade as pro-anorexia. And that's why they use these tags which would imply that they're pro-anorexia, but they're actually pro-recovery. And so the question is, does this strategy help? Does masquerading as a pro-anorexia person when you're pro-recovery work in order to get the pro-anorexia people to stop doing what they're doing? So here's what we did. We asked the question, if you were a pro-anorexia or a pro-recovery user and you got a comment from a pro-anorexia or a pro-recovery user, would you cease your harmful behavior or your beneficial behavior if you're pro-recovery? So what are the chances that you will stop putting these photographs that you used to put on before, but you would still be active on the site? So, for example, this is somebody receiving a comment from a pro-anorexia user, either being pro-recovery or pro-anorexia. And you can see that the likelihood is the same. If you get a comment from a pro-anorexia person, you stop putting your photographs with exactly the same probability of 61%. However, if you are a pro-anorexia person and you receive a comment from a pro-recovery person, you're less likely to stop posting these photographs. You're more likely to continue engaging with your harmful behavior. Whereas if you're a pro-recovery person and you got a comment from a pro-recovery person, so somebody who actually tries to encourage you, you are more likely to stop. So obviously, this kind of intervention of people with the zeal of a convert who try to explain to the pro-anorexia people what they're doing wrong is actually counterproductive. Now, people have tried to find other interventions, other ways to stop the pro-anorexia behavior, such as banning content, blocking sites. These things don't work. And obviously, this one here doesn't work either. And so right now, one of the things that we're doing is trying to find an algorithmic way in which to choose the right content to present to these people in order for them to stop their harmful behavior. And I'll skip the hazard model, which bears this out. The other question I wanted to talk about was the question of how do actually people get to the stage that they're engaged in anorexia or that they are ill with anorexia. As you may know, Israel has recently passed a law that prevents models with a BMI of under 18.5 from being displayed in public media. That law was passed with relatively little science behind it, and the reason is that it's really hard to get that science. It's really hard to track a large population over a long time, see what kind of media they're exposed to, what kind of books they're reading, magazines, what kinds of things they see on billboards, and then see whether that has any causal connection to the development of anorexia. And so we thought, well, we could do this in the virtual world, and maybe it will tell us something interesting about the physical one. So here's what we did. We know in the US, again, we know that of a list of approximately 3,600 celebrities, and we scored each one of them for what we call the perceived anorexia score. This means the probability that a celebrity will be mentioned together with anorexia or anorectic. On the other hand, we also looked at users who asked about behaviors which seem to imply some kind of a tendency towards anorexia. Things like tips for pro-anorectic users, or how do I become anorectic, or how do I lie to my parents to think that I'm eating when I'm not? You would be surprised how many such queries we have. Or searching for a pro-ana buddy. That means somebody that will help me reinforce me in losing weight. In our data, we had about 6 million users who looked for one of these celebrities, specifically one of those who are most perceived as anorectic, the top 2.5%. And so on the one hand, we have people looking for celebrities who are perceived as anorectic. On the other hand, we have the anorectic behaviors. And the first thing we did was we just clustered the users. This is a somewhat bigger subset of 9 million users, 3,600 celebrities. We clustered them to see are celebrities browsed by the same people, essentially. And what you see in the graph here are the sizes of the clusters, both by random assignment, so this is the red one, and according to the data, which is the blue. And you see that we have a tendency in the blue clusters for somewhat larger clusters. Indeed, when you measure the association of these clusters to things like the perceived anorexia score, that comes out as significant, but anything else, occupation, age, a bunch of other features does not. So people tend to browse these celebrities, at least some of them, according to how much they're perceived as anorectic. But we were more interested in the question of whether there is some kind of timeline here. So are people first browsing these perceived anorexia users and then developing the anorectic tendencies? So we had this hazard model here, and we look at a few attributes: number of searches, number of searches for celebrities in general. These are sort of straw attributes. And then the number of searches for the top perceived anorectic celebrities. And you can see that the only one with any effect is this one. So if you browse, or if these users browsed a celebrity that had a large perceived anorexia score, they were 14% more likely to develop these anorectic behaviors. And if they browse more than one of them, the hazard actually jumps significantly. So if somebody's very interested in people, in celebrities who are perceived as very anorectic, they're very likely to develop these behaviors. However, this is just correlation, it's not causation. And moreover, when we looked at the list of the most perceived celebrities perceived as anorectic, we saw that some of them were actually sort of have-beens. So some of them were actually people who died from anorexia. Some of them were no longer in the public sphere. And it was a question of why do these people actually query for these celebrities? And this is where we tried to add the media effect. The way that we did this was we looked at Twitter. Twitter is well known to reflect what's happening on mainstream media. And so we looked at tweets that mentioned these celebrities. A nice thing that seems to happen, times 0 here is the time when we see a spike in tweets about a celebrity. And the graph shows how many searches we see for that celebrity over time. And you can see that there's this huge spike. So what seems to happen is that there is talk about a celebrity on Twitter, and then people turn to a search engine in order to get more information about this celebrity. And there's a very good correlation between the timing of the peaks. So we can add this effect, and we can ask, now it seems to be more causal, right? Because it's hard to argue that there's no causal effect here. The causal effect here is that the media starts talking about a celebrity. That celebrity is mentioned on Twitter. That causes a change of searches on, in this case, Bing. And later on, some people may or may not develop these anorectic searches. So back to our hazard model. This time, I'm adding 2 more columns. First one is the question of whether there is a peak in Twitter activity related to anorexia before the person asked about this celebrity. And the second is whether that peak in Twitter activity mentioned anorexia, either in the text of the tweets or, more often, in the pages of news they referred to. So does the tweet say, oh, look at this beautiful celebrity, or does it say, look at this anorectic celebrity? And what you see, so the 2 previous hazards are pretty much the same. If there was a peak in Twitter activity before, that raises the hazard of people developing anorectic behaviors by 33%. What's nice, I think, is that if that peak in Twitter activity mentioned anorexia, so mentioned that this celebrity was actually sick, that hazard is almost completely removed. So if you frame, or if the news piece framed that person as being ill, nobody wants to follow somebody who's ill. Whereas if they mention them just in a general context, or more often in the context that they are beautiful or they are somebody who should be followed, then that increases the hazard of anorexia. So by looking at this kind of data of the searches on Bing on the other hand, and on Twitter behavior, we can back up the science behind this law that prevents the presentation of underweight models. And so I think these kinds of studies are interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, they allow us to look at a very large population. Bing, Yahoo, and especially Google, of course, have access to a huge number of people, and so doing studies that are virtually impossible in the physical world suddenly become possible when you look at the virtual one. We can look at long-term effects, which are, again, harder to do in the physical world. But we really need this connection between the medical doctors and the machine learning people in order to get the interesting insights. And so as people spend ever more time on the internet, they provide us with content that allows us to learn about health and medicine. From our previous studies, we know that this content is especially useful when people have less of an incentive to lie compared to the real world. So things like search engines and Yahoo Answers are very good. Things like Facebook and Twitter may be less so because they're identifiable, so people are less inclined to provide truthful information. In cases where collecting data in the real world is hard, we have an edge, so large populations, but even in smaller cases. For example, we looked at the information searches of people who have just been told they have cancer. Think about how you would go about collecting such data in the physical world, about the mental states of people who just came out of their doctor's office being told possibly the worst news in their lives. That's nearly impossible to do in the physical world. We can do it in the virtual one. And the last case is when the activity is web-driven, and in Anorexia, ProRecovery and Proanorexia is one case in point. And as I said, making sense of this kind of data requires machine learning to crunch the data on the one hand. On the other hand, we really need the medical people to tell us what's interesting and what may be less so. Thank you very much.